For most of human history, nobody spoke, not because they had nothing to say, because the machinery to say it didn't exist yet. Every conversation you've ever had, every book ever written, every law, every lie, every love letter, every argument, every prayer, all of it depends on something humans stumbled into almost entirely by accident. Language was never designed, nobody sat down and decided to invent words, and yet somehow, out of all the species on Earth, only one developed the ability to take abstract thoughts and push them out of its body as sound. Not dolphins, not chimpanzees, not the incredibly intelligent crows that can solve multi-step puzzles, just humans. And the strangest part is that we still don't fully understand how it happened. To understand the mystery, you have to imagine the world before language existed at all. Around 2 million years ago, early human ancestors were already doing remarkable things. They were making tools, sharpening stones into cutting edges, carrying resources across landscapes, living in coordinated groups, but they were doing all of this in near silence. Not complete silence, they almost certainly made sounds, grunts, screams, warning calls, basic emotional signals that many primates still use today. But those sounds weren't language. A chimpanzee can scream when it sees a predator. It cannot tell another chimpanzee what the predator looked like, which direction it came from, or what happened the last time one appeared near this river. That gap between a warning cry and an actual sentence is one of the largest gaps in the entire history of life on Earth. So what crossed it? The first piece of the puzzle is physical. Language isn't just a mental ability, it's a biological one. And for most of human evolutionary history, our ancestors literally could not produce the sounds that language requires. The human voice box, the larynx, sits much lower in the throat than in other primates. That lowered position creates a longer vocal tract, which allows humans to produce an enormous range of distinct sounds. Vowels, consonants, tones, subtle variations that carry meaning. Chimpanzees cannot physically produce most of the sounds in human speech. Their anatomy won't allow it. At some point in human evolution, the larynx descended slowly, over hundreds of thousands of years, and the throat quietly became capable of something it had never been capable of before. But physical machinery alone doesn't explain language. Plenty of animals can produce complex sounds, birds can mimic human voices with terrifying accuracy, parrots can learn hundreds of words, and yet none of them are sitting around having conversations about what happened last Tuesday. Because language isn't just sound production. Language is symbolic thinking, the ability to let one thing represent another thing entirely. The word fire is not fire, it's a sound that your brain has agreed to connect to the concept of fire. That connection is completely arbitrary. In another language, fire is called something completely different and it works just as well. Symbols are abstract, and abstraction requires a type of brain that took a very long time to evolve. Here's where things get strange. Around 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, something shifted in human behavior so dramatically that archaeologists named it. They call it the cognitive revolution. Before this period, human tools were functional but repetitive. The same basic stone tools appeared across thousands of years with almost no variation. And then suddenly, humans started doing things no other animal had ever done. Cave paintings appeared, personal ornaments appeared, burial rituals appeared, long-distance trade appeared. Humans were clearly thinking in symbols, storing ideas, and sharing them across groups and generations. Most researchers believe language and this cognitive explosion are directly connected, not because language caused bigger brains, but because bigger brains slowly, accidentally crossed a threshold where symbolic communication became possible. And once it became possible, everything accelerated. But here's the part nobody talks about. The first language probably wasn't spoken at all. Some researchers believe early humans communicated symbolically through gesture long before they communicated through sound. The evidence is subtle but persistent. Human hands are extraordinarily expressive. The same neural regions that control hand movements in the brain are closely linked to language processing. Babies learn to point before they learn to speak. Deaf communities across the world, with no contact with each other, independently developed fully structured sign languages. Even today, humans gesture constantly while speaking, and removing gesture actually makes speech harder to understand. The leading theory is that gesture and speech evolved together, tangled around each other over hundreds of thousands of years, until eventually sound became dominant. Probably because sound works in the dark. Sound works when your hands are full. Sound works across distances too large for gesture to carry. And then something happened that locked language in permanently. Humans began living in larger, more complex social groups, and complex social groups created a problem that only language could solve. Think about what life inside a large group actually requires. You need to coordinate hunts, you need to negotiate who gets what, you need to track who owes favors and who violated agreements, you need to share information about dangers, resources, and strangers. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed that language evolved primarily as a form of social glue. Early humans used it the same way other primates use grooming, to build relationships, manage alliances, and keep track of an increasingly complicated social world. In other words, the first conversations may not have been about survival at all. They may have been gossip, humans talking about other humans, sharing information about who could be trusted, who had done something remarkable, who had betrayed the group. That social function gave language an enormous survival advantage. Groups that could communicate complex information cooperated better, they hunted more effectively, they shared knowledge across generations. A discovery made by one person could spread to hundreds of people without each one having to discover it independently. Language made human knowledge cumulative in a way nothing else in the history of life had ever been. Think about how extraordinary that is. Every other animal is essentially born starting from scratch. A wolf born today knows what wolves have always known, but a human child born today inherits thousands of years of accumulated knowledge before they can even read. Language made that possible. It turned individual experience into shared civilization. And then humans did something with language that may be the strangest thing any species has ever done. They wrote it down. Around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, humans started making marks on clay tablets to represent sounds and words. Writing wasn't invented to record poetry or philosophy. The earliest written records are trade receipts, grain deliveries, livestock counts, bureaucratic paperwork from ancient civilizations trying to manage complex economies. But writing did something that spoken language alone could not. It made information permanent. A spoken word disappears the moment it leaves the air. A written word can survive thousands of years. Suddenly, humans could communicate across time. The dead could speak to the living. Ideas didn't have to be remembered, they could be stored, and stored ideas could be built upon by people who never met the original thinker. Every scientific discovery since then has depended on that chain. Newton building on Kepler, Einstein building on Newton, every equation, every experiment, every medical breakthrough, every technology that defines the modern world traces back through an unbroken line of accumulated written knowledge that started with someone pressing a reed into wet clay to record how many goats crossed a river. And it all started with grunts near a fire. No design, no plan, a descended larynx that happened to allow new sounds, a brain that happened to cross a threshold for symbolic thinking, hands that learned to gesture before throats learned to speak, social groups that grew complicated enough to demand better coordination. Each piece arrived accidentally, independently, and then collided into something that changed everything. Tonight you will have conversations. You will read words that exist inside a device that exists because of science, that exists because of writing, that exists because of language, that began forming hundreds of thousands of years ago in a mind that had no idea what it was starting. You are the only animal on Earth that can know that.